The name appears only once in the official records of Salem Village, Massachusetts, written in ink that has faded to rust brown over 3 centuries. TITUBA. No family name, no place of origin. Just a single word marking the testimony of a woman who confessed to witchcraft in February 1692, then vanished from every subsequent document as if she had never existed. But here's what the sanitized history books don't tell you. TITUBA's confession didn't just start the Salem witch trials. It contained details so specific, so disturbing, that the magistrates ordered entire portions stricken from the public record. For over 200 years, historians claimed these pages were lost. They weren't lost. They were hidden. And what they reveal about the true nature of Salem's hysteria, about who orchestrated it and why, is a story that powerful families spent generations ensuring would never reach the light. Before we continue with the story of TITUBA and the conspiracy that made her disappear, if you enjoy uncovering the darkest secrets of American history, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story that challenges everything you thought you knew. What happened in Salem in 1692 wasn't an accident. It was the final explosion of tensions that had been building for over a decade, in a community that was already fracturing under the weight of its own contradictions. Salem Village in late 1691 was not a place of peace. Despite what travelers saw, neat clapboard houses arranged around a common, smoke rising from chimneys into the grey Massachusetts sky, fields marked by stone walls that spoke of back-breaking labor, the settlement was fracturing from within. Only 15 years old, as an independent parish, Salem Village existed in the shadow of its wealthier neighbor, Salem Town, where merchant ships brought prosperity the farmers could only dream of. The village consisted of perhaps 600 souls, spread across farmland that grew rockier and less productive each year. Families who had arrived with high hopes found themselves struggling against thin soil, harsh winters, and the constant fear of raids from the north, where King William's War still raged against French and indigenous forces. The war had been devastating to the Massachusetts frontier. Since 1688, coordinated attacks by French forces and their Wabanaki allies had destroyed settlements throughout Maine and New Hampshire. Refugees flooded south, bringing tales of burning homes, captured families, and midnight massacres. Several families in Salem Village had taken in these refugees, hearing first-hand accounts of violence that fed a pervasive anxiety. The enemy could be anywhere, could strike at any time. This fear of invisible threats would prove crucial to what was coming. But it was the internal conflicts that truly poisoned Salem Village. The western farmers, led by families like the Putnams, who had been among the first settlers, resented the eastern landowners who maintained closer ties to Salem Town's merchant elite. This wasn't merely economic jealousy. It was a fundamental disagreement about the community's identity. Were they independent farmers building a godly commonwealth? Or were they merely a rural appendage to the commercial interests of Salem Town? The question infected every aspect of village life. These tensions played out most visibly in the village church, where the position of minister had become a battleground. The congregation had gone through 3 ministers in 15 years, each departure marked by bitter disputes over salary, housing, and authority. The Reverend Samuel Parris had arrived in 1689, the latest attempt to bring stability to a fractured community. He would instead preside over its destruction. Parris was 46 years old when he came to Salem Village, a man whose life had been marked by failure and resentment. Born in London to a family with merchant connections, he had been sent to Harvard but never graduated. He'd tried his hand at trade in Barbados, where his father had left him a small plantation, but proved incompetent at managing either the business or the enslaved people who worked it. By the mid-1680s, he was bankrupt, forced to sell most of his holdings. What he retained were 2 enslaved people, a man named John and a woman named TITUBA. The relationship between Parris and TITUBA was the subject of whispered speculation even before they arrived in Massachusetts. Some claimed she had been his concubine in Barbados, that his marriage to Elizabeth Eldridge in 1681 had been an attempt to establish respectability. There was no proof of this, but the rumors persisted. fed by the fact that Paris seemed to trust Tituba with responsibilities far beyond what was typical for an enslaved woman. She managed his household, had access to his papers, and was present during private family discussions. This unusual closeness would later seem significant. When Paris turned to ministry, it was less a calling than a last resort. The Puritan Church in Massachusetts was always short of educated ministers willing to serve in rural parishes, and Paris's partial Harvard education was enough to qualify him. He preached his first sermons in Salem Village in 1688, and after months of negotiation over salary and property rights, was officially ordained in November 1689. He brought with him his wife Elizabeth, their 3 children, Thomas, Elizabeth, called Betty, and Susanna, his orphaned niece Abigail Williams, and his 2 enslaved people. From the beginning, Paris's ministry was contentious. He preached sermons about invisible enemies and conspiracies against the righteous, sermons that grew darker as winter approached. He saw threats everywhere, in the congregation members who questioned his salary, in the farmers who resisted his authority, in the very land itself which seemed hostile to godly settlement. His worldview was fundamentally paranoid, dividing all people into the saved and the damned, with the latter far outnumbering the former. He told his congregation that Satan had established a kingdom in the wilderness surrounding them, that demons walked among them disguised as neighbors and friends. This rhetoric resonated with some villagers and repelled others. The Putnam family, led by Thomas Putnam and his brothers, became Paris's strongest supporters. They saw in him an ally against the Salem town faction and a voice for their vision of a pure, independent farming community. The Porter family and their allies, who maintained commercial ties to Salem town, viewed Paris as a divisive troublemaker. They withheld portions of his salary and challenged his right to own the parsonage and its land. By late 1691, the village was essentially split into 2 camps, with Paris's position growing increasingly precarious. It was into this poisonous atmosphere that Tituba disappeared each night, climbing the narrow stairs to the unheated attic room she shared with John. She was perhaps 30 years old, though no one had ever asked. Her skin marked her as different in a community that prided itself on English purity, though whether she was African, indigenous, or mixed, the villagers debated in whispers. Some claimed she was a Carib from the islands, others said she was African by way of Barbados, still others insisted she had Spanish or Portuguese blood. The truth was that no one knew, and no one cared enough to ask her directly. She was simply the Indian woman, or Paris's slave, her identity reduced to her status. Tituba spoke rarely and always in a peculiar accent that some claimed was Spanish, others Portuguese, still others a corrupted English picked up in the Caribbean. She had learned the language in Barbados, that much was known, before Paris purchased her and brought her to the frozen north. The transition must have been devastating, from tropical heat to New England winter, from a plantation with dozens of other enslaved people to isolation in a hostile village, from a place where her knowledge of herbs and healing was valued to one where such knowledge was viewed with suspicion. She worked from dawn until long after dark, cooking, cleaning, tending the garden, caring for Betty and Abigail, spinning, weaving, making soap and candles, all the endless labor that kept a colonial household functioning. Paris paid her nothing, of course. She was property, not a person. But he also depended on her completely. His wife Elizabeth was often ill, suffering from ailments that were never clearly diagnosed, but which left her bedridden for days at a time. Without Tituba, the household would have collapsed. In the kitchen where Tituba spent most of her hours, there was a particular stone in the hearth that had cracked from repeated heating and cooling. She would stare at that crack sometimes when she thought no one was watching. The pattern resembled a bird in flight, wings spread wide. Those who noticed thought she was simple-minded, prone to daydreaming. They had no idea she was remembering. Remembering what exactly? The historical record is silent. But we can imagine. Perhaps a life before enslavement, before the Middle Passage, or the plantation, or the sail that brought her to Paris. Perhaps family, language, home, all the things that had been stripped away. Or perhaps she was simply planning. calculating, waiting for an opportunity that she knew would eventually come, because Tituba, as events would prove, was anything but simple-minded. The other person who spent significant time in the Paris household was Abigail Williams, Paris's niece. She was 11 years old in the winter of 1691-1692, orphaned under circumstances that were never clearly explained. Some said her parents had died in an Indian raid in Maine, others that they had succumbed to disease. Paris had taken her in out of family obligation, but he treated her more as a servant than a daughter. Abigail slept in a small room off the kitchen, helped Tituba with household work, and received minimal education beyond basic reading and religious instruction. Abigail was a sharp, observant child with a talent for reading people. She understood the tensions in the household, her uncle's resentment at his treatment by the congregation, her aunt's chronic illness, the whispered arguments about money. She also understood that her position was precarious. If Paris's ministry failed, if the family had to leave Salem Village, what would become of her? An orphaned girl with no property and no prospects had few options in colonial Massachusetts. She would likely be bound out as a servant to whatever family would take her. This anxiety made Abigail hyper-aware of power dynamics. She watched how her uncle wielded authority through his sermons, how certain families commanded respect while others were dismissed. She noticed that accusations carried weight, that reputation could be destroyed by whispers. She was learning lessons that would soon prove catastrophic. Betty Paris, by contrast, was a fragile, anxious child. At 9 years old, she was prone to nightmares and crying fits. Her father's dark sermons terrified her. He preached about children being born in sin, about the devil seeking to claim young souls, about the torments awaiting the damned. Betty took these warnings literally, lying awake at night convinced that demons were waiting in the shadows of her room. Her mother's illness frightened her as well. She had already lost one infant sibling, and the fear that her mother might die haunted her. The relationship between Betty and Abigail was complex. They were close in age and spent most of their time together, but they were not equals. Betty was the minister's daughter, entitled to deference. Abigail was the orphaned dependent, always aware of her inferior status. This dynamic would become crucial as events unfolded. The winter of 1691-1692 came early and stayed late. By January, snow lay 3 feet deep in places, and the wood supply in many homes ran dangerously low. The Paris household suffered along with the rest. The minister's salary was perpetually in arrears, paid partly in firewood that never seemed enough. Betty spent hours shivering by the insufficient fire while her father penned sermons about godly suffering. Abigail tried to entertain them both with games and stories, but the long dark pressed in on them. The isolation was profound. In summer, children could play outside, women could visit neighbors, men could work in the fields. But winter locked everyone indoors, sometimes for days at a time, when storms made travel impossible. The Paris household was particularly isolated because of the minister's conflicts with much of the congregation. Families that might have invited the children for visits stayed away. The girls had few friends, little entertainment, and endless empty hours to fill. It was Abigail who first asked Tituba to tell them stories. The enslaved woman resisted at first. Her place was to work silently, to be invisible despite her visible difference. But Abigail was persistent, and eventually, on a January evening when Reverend Paris was visiting a parishioner and Mrs. Paris lay ill in bed, Tituba sat with the 2 girls by the dying fire and began to speak. She told them about Barbados, the impossible heat that made New England's summer feel cool by comparison, plants that bloomed in colors that didn't exist in gray Massachusetts, birds that could mimic human voices so perfectly you couldn't tell them from people. She described sugar plantations where hundreds of enslaved people worked fields that stretched to the horizon, and the songs they sang to make the labor bearable. She spoke of the ocean, vast and blue-green, so different from the cold gray Atlantic that bordered Massachusetts. The girls were entranced. They had never traveled beyond Salem and its immediate surroundings. The world TITUBA described was exotic, almost unimaginable. They begged for more stories, and TITUBA obliged, night after night when circumstances allowed. She told them about the different peoples who lived in Barbados. Africans from various kingdoms, indigenous people from the mainland, Europeans from England and Spain and Portugal and Holland, all mixed together in ways that would have been impossible in Puritan New England. And then, because the girls begged for something frightening, she told them about the Obeah practitioners she had known, people who could read the future in eggs and water, who knew which plants could cure and which could kill, who understood that the world held forces the English ministers never mentioned in their sermons. She shouldn't have. She knew even as the words left her mouth that she was making a terrible mistake. But there was power in being listened to, in seeing these privileged white girls lean forward with wide eyes, hanging on her every word. For a few stolen hours, TITUBA was not invisible. She was the center of attention, the keeper of knowledge, the one with power. It was intoxicating and dangerous in equal measure. The sessions continued, always in secret. TITUBA taught them small tricks, how to crack an egg into a glass of water, and interpret the shapes the white made as it dispersed, how to listen to the wind in the chimney and distinguish natural sounds from something more. She showed them herbs from her carefully tended corner of the garden, explained their properties. Pennyroyal for women's complaints, tansy for fever, foxglove for the heart, though it could kill if the dose was wrong. It was innocent knowledge, the kind every woman carried in the Caribbean, the kind that kept people alive in a world without doctors or apothecaries. But in Puritan New England, it was something else entirely. The knowledge of herbs was acceptable when practiced by English goodwives who had learned from their mothers. But when it came from a dark-skinned woman from the Caribbean, it became suspect. It smacked of popery, of heathen practices, of the kind of folk magic that the church condemned as devil worship. TITUBA must have known this. She had lived in Massachusetts for over 2 years by this point, long enough to understand how differently her knowledge was perceived here. But she continued the sessions anyway, perhaps because the risk seemed small compared to the reward of those few hours when she was treated as something other than property. Anne Putnam, 12 years old and daughter of the powerful Thomas Putnam, heard about the sessions from Abigail. The two girls had become friendly at church gatherings, and Abigail, proud of her secret knowledge, couldn't resist hinting at it. Anne demanded to be included and brought with her several other girls. Elizabeth Hubbard, 17, who lived with the village doctor. Mary Walcott, 16, from another prominent family. Mercy Lewis, 19, a servant in the Putnam household who had survived an Indian raid that killed her parents. The circle expanded to include 8 or 9 girls, ranging in age from 9 to 19. They gathered in the Paris kitchen on late January afternoons, ostensibly for prayer and needlework, but really to listen to TITUBA describe a world so different from their frozen, restricted existence that it might as well have been another planet. They practiced the egg and glass divination, trying to see their future husbands in the shapes. They learned about herbs and their properties. They heard stories about people who could see the future, communicate with the dead, influence events through ritual and knowledge. For the girls, this was thrilling. Their lives were severely constrained by Puritan expectations. No dancing, no singing except psalms, no games, no frivolity. Their futures were predetermined. Marriage, childbearing, household labor, early death. The knowledge TITUBA offered suggested other possibilities, other ways of having power and agency in a world that offered them none. What none of them knew was that TITUBA was being watched. Reverend Paris had noticed the change in his daughter. A new animation in her eyes, whispered conversations with Abigail that stopped when he entered. He suspected youthful mischief, perhaps even the dangerous frivolity that could lead to dancing or singing, sins that could corrupt a young soul. He began to spy on his own household, listening at doors, watching through cracks in the floorboards from the room above. What he heard alarmed him. TITUBA speaking about practices he recognized as witchcraft. His daughter and niece participating eagerly. other girls from the village involved. This was exactly the kind of corruption he had warned about in his sermons. Satan working through the most innocent-seeming vessels to establish his kingdom. But Paris didn't act immediately. He was a calculating man, always aware of his precarious position. An accusation of witchcraft was serious, potentially dangerous to the accuser if it couldn't be proven. He needed to be certain. He needed evidence. So he continued to watch and listen, gathering information, waiting for the right moment. That moment came in late January when Betty Paris began to have fits. They started as screaming nightmares that woke the household. The 9-year-old would sit bolt upright in bed, eyes wide but unseeing, and shriek about flames and demons. Mrs. Paris rushed to comfort her, but Betty seemed not to recognize her own mother. She spoke in a strange voice, sometimes crying out words that made no sense, sometimes going rigid and silent for minutes at a time. The fits progressed quickly. Soon Betty was having episodes during the day, crying out in pain, contorting her body into strange positions. She would suddenly freeze in the middle of a task, staring at something no one else could see. She complained of being pricked by invisible needles, of pressure on her chest that made it hard to breathe. She tried to throw herself into the fire and had to be physically restrained. Reverend Paris was initially convinced this was divine punishment for some sin in his household. He led hours-long prayer sessions, begging God to reveal what transgression had brought this affliction upon his daughter. But the fits only worsened. Betty began having convulsions, her body jerking violently. She made sounds like a dog barking or a cat hissing. She tried to bite people who came near her. The village doctor, William Griggs, was called. He was an elderly man with limited medical knowledge, trained through apprenticeship rather than formal education. He examined Betty thoroughly, checking for fever, looking for signs of disease, asking about her diet and habits. He found nothing physically wrong. Her pulse was strong, her color good, no signs of illness. Yet clearly something was terribly wrong. After several visits, Dr. Griggs spoke the words that would doom Salem. The evil hand is upon her. In the medical understanding of the time, this was a diagnosis of last resort. When no natural cause could be found for an illness, especially one involving strange behaviors and convulsions, supernatural causes were considered. The evil hand meant witchcraft. Someone was using occult means to torment the child. The diagnosis spread through the village like wildfire. The minister's daughter was bewitched. Satan had struck at the heart of the godly community. If the minister's own household wasn't safe, no one was. Within days, Abigail Williams began displaying similar symptoms. She had fits during which she screamed and convulsed. She claimed to see specters, ghostly figures that tormented her. She tried to run up the chimney, insisting she could fly. She spoke in voices that didn't sound like her own. The two girls' afflictions seemed to feed off each other, each episode triggering a response in the other. Then Ann Putnam began having fits. Then Elizabeth Hubbard. Then Mary Wolcott. The affliction spread among the girls who had gathered in TITUBA's circle, each developing similar symptoms. They would freeze in place mid-conversation or suddenly cry out as if being stabbed by invisible needles. They saw visions, dark shapes in the corners of rooms, animals that spoke with human voices, women flying through the night air. The pattern of symptoms was remarkably consistent across all the afflicted girls. They experienced sudden fits of screaming and convulsing, periods of rigid paralysis, sensations of being pricked, pinched, or bitten by invisible forces, visions of specters that others couldn't see, speaking in strange voices or languages, attempting dangerous acts like running into fire or up chimneys, physical contortions that seemed impossible for their bodies. Modern medical historians have proposed various explanations for these symptoms. Some suggest ergot poisoning from contaminated rye. Ergot is a fungus that can cause convulsions and hallucinations. Others point to encephalitis, epilepsy, or psychological factors like mass hysteria or conversion disorder. Some argue the girls were simply faking, engaged in a conspiracy of fraud. But in February 1692, there was only one explanation that made sense to the villagers: witchcraft. Someone was using demonic power to torment these innocent girls. The question was, who? The village erupted into panic. Families gathered for prayer meetings that lasted hours, begging God to protect them from the invisible evil. Reverend Paris preached sermons about Satan's assault on the godly, about the need to root out the witches who had made a covenant with the devil. The Putnam family, powerful and influential, demanded action. If Satan had established a foothold in Salem village, the godly had an obligation to destroy it. But there was a problem. The afflicted girls couldn't or wouldn't name their tormentors. When asked who was afflicting them, they would cry out in pain, claiming the witches were choking them to prevent them from speaking. This went on for weeks, building tension and fear throughout the community. Behind the scenes, pressure was building on the girls to name names. Their families questioned them repeatedly. Reverend Paris interrogated Betty and Abigail for hours. The village leaders made it clear that the crisis couldn't be resolved until the witches were identified. The girls were the only ones who could see the specters, the only ones who could name the guilty. The entire community was depending on them. It's impossible to know what was going through the girls' minds during this period. Were they genuinely experiencing something they interpreted as supernatural attack? Were they caught up in a shared delusion, each girl's symptoms reinforcing the others? Were they consciously fabricating, enjoying the attention and power their afflictions brought them? Or was it some combination of all three, perhaps starting with genuine illness or psychological distress, then being shaped and directed by adult expectations and pressure? What's clear is that by late February, the girls were ready to name names, and the names they chose were not random. On February 25, 1692, arrest warrants were issued for 3 women: Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and TITUBA. The choice of these 3 was not random, though the villagers would later claim the afflicted girls had named them spontaneously during fits. Each woman had been carefully selected for maximum vulnerability. Sarah Good was perhaps 40 years old, though she looked older. She had once been from a respectable family, but her father's suicide and subsequent legal battles over his estate had left her impoverished. Her first husband died, leaving debts, and her second husband, William Good, was a laborer who could barely support them. They were homeless, moving from place to place, sleeping in barns and begging for food and shelter. Sarah had a sharp tongue and cursed those who refused her charity. She smoked a pipe, unusual for a woman. She had given birth to a baby girl just months earlier, and the infant was sickly. Sarah was exactly the kind of person Puritans associated with witchcraft: poor, angry, disreputable, living on the margins of society. Sarah Osborne was in her late 50s, bedridden with illness. She had scandalized the community years earlier by living with her second husband before marrying him. She had also been involved in a legal dispute with the Putnam family over land. She rarely attended church, claiming illness prevented her. Like Sarah Good, she was already marked as different and difficult, someone the community would easily believe capable of witchcraft. And then there was TITUBA, enslaved, dark-skinned, foreign, known to have knowledge of herbs and Caribbean practices. She was the perfect scapegoat, legally powerless with no family to defend her and no standing to refuse anything demanded of her. But TITUBA was also the key. The Putnam family had been asking questions, gathering information. They knew about the kitchen sessions, the stories, the egg and glass divinations. They knew she had been teaching the girls practices that could be interpreted as witchcraft. They knew she was vulnerable, and they knew that if they could get her to confess, it would validate everything: the girls' afflictions, the existence of a witchcraft conspiracy, the need for aggressive prosecution. What they didn't know was that TITUBA had already made a choice. She had seen this coming. She had watched the girls' afflictions spread, had heard the whispers, had felt the net closing around her. She knew she would be accused, and she had decided exactly how she would respond. The preliminary examinations took place in the Salem Village meeting house on March 1st. The building was packed. Nearly every villager had come to witness the spectacle. People stood in the aisles, crowded into the gallery, pressed against the walls. The atmosphere was electric with fear and anticipation. Magistrates John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin had traveled from Salem town to conduct the proceedings. Hathorne was a wealthy merchant and politician, a man of considerable power in the colony. He was also deeply convinced of the reality of witchcraft and the need to prosecute it aggressively. He would conduct the examinations not as neutral inquiries but as prosecutions, assuming guilt and demanding confession. The afflicted girls sat in prominent places, surrounded by family members who supported them when the fits came. Betty and Abigail Parris, Ann Putnam Jr., Elizabeth Hubbard, Mary Walcott, Mercy Lewis. They ranged in age from 9 to 19, but in that moment they held more power than anyone else in the room. Their words would determine who lived and who died. Sarah Good was questioned first. She was brought in looking haggard and defiant, her baby in her arms. Hathorne began with an accusation disguised as a question. "Sarah Good, what evil spirit have you familiarity with?" "None," Sarah replied. "Have you made no contract with the devil?" "No." "Why do you hurt these children?" "I do not hurt them, I scorn it." The magistrate pressed her, asking the same questions in different forms, trying to trap her in contradictions. Sarah denied everything with sullen defiance, insisting she was innocent, that she had never hurt the children, never made any covenant with the devil. But her denials were interrupted by the afflicted girls, who began to writhe and scream, claiming Sarah's spectre was tormenting them even as she stood in the meeting house. "Sarah Good, do you not see now what you have done?" Hathorne demanded. "Why do you not tell us the truth? Why do you thus torment these poor children?" "I do not torment them," Sarah insisted. "Who do you employ then to do it?" "I employ nobody." "What creature do you employ then?" "No creature, but I am falsely accused." The examination went on for hours. The girls continued to have fits, crying out that Sarah's spectre was choking them, stabbing them with invisible needles. At one point, Sarah's own husband, William, was called to testify. He said he was afraid his wife either was a witch or would be one very quickly. He claimed she was an enemy to all good. This testimony from her own husband was devastating. In Puritan culture, a husband was supposed to defend and protect his wife. William Good's willingness to testify against Sarah suggested even her closest relation believed her guilty. The magistrates took it as powerful evidence. After hours of interrogation that went nowhere, Sarah continued to deny everything. The girls continued to accuse her. She was led away to be held for trial. Sarah Osborne came next. She was brought in on a chair, too ill to stand for long. She too denied all charges, growing increasingly desperate as the magistrates ignored her protests. She was sick, she pleaded, had been ill for months. How could she torment children when she could barely leave her bed? "The devil may appear in your shape and do mischief without your knowledge or consent," Hathorne suggested, introducing the concept of spectral evidence that would become central to the trials. The idea was that a witch's spectre, her ghostly form, could leave her body and torment people while she herself was elsewhere. This made it impossible to defend against accusations. An alibi meant nothing if your spectre could act independently. The afflicted girls convulsed. Abigail Williams shrieked that Sarah Osborne's spectre was pressing on her chest, suffocating her. Ann Putnam cried out that she saw Sarah's spectre with a yellow bird that was sucking between her fingers. The bird was supposedly a familiar spirit, a demon in animal form that served the witch. Sarah Osborne protested her innocence, but she made a fatal mistake. She mentioned that she had once been frightened by a thing like an Indian, all black, that had appeared to her in a dream. The magistrate seized on this. She had seen a demon. She had admitted to supernatural experiences. This was taken as evidence of her guilt. The old woman was dragged away, weeping, still protesting that she was innocent and had never hurt anyone. Then they brought in TITUBA. She stood before the magistrates, a dark-skinned woman in a plain gray dress, her eyes downcast. Reverend Parris sat in the front row, his face rigid. He had beaten her the night before. she would later testify, demanding to know what she had done to his daughter. The welts on her back throbbed with each breath. She knew what they wanted from her. More importantly, she knew what they needed. The meeting house fell silent. Everyone leaned forward. This was the moment they had been waiting for. The examination of the foreign woman, the one who had brought her heathen practices into their godly community. Magistrate Hathorn asked the first question. "TITUBA, what evil spirit have you familiarity with?" She raised her eyes and met his gaze directly. For a moment, she said nothing. The silence stretched. Then, in a clear voice that carried to every corner of the packed meeting house, she spoke. "The devil came to me and bid me serve him." The meeting house erupted. Gasps, cries, people calling out to God. This was the first confession. After hours of denials from the other two women, here was confirmation that witchcraft truly walked among them. Here was proof that the girls' afflictions were real, that the devil was indeed operating in Salem Village. Hathorn leaned forward, eager. "Who have you seen with the devil?" And TITUBA began to speak. She described a tall man from Boston dressed all in black who came to her and demanded she sign his book in blood. He appeared to her sometimes as a man, sometimes as a dog, sometimes as a hog. He showed her a book with 9 names written in it, though she couldn't read most of them. She saw Sarah Good's name there, and Sarah Osborne's. There were others too, but she didn't know who they were. "What did the devil promise you if you would serve him?" Hathorn asked. "He said he would give me many fine things," TITUBA replied. "What did he want you to do?" He wanted me to hurt the children." "And did you hurt them?" Here TITUBA paused and tears began to stream down her face. "He made me hurt them. I tried not to, but he was too powerful. He hurt me when I refused." She showed marks on her arms, bruises that could have been from anything but which she claimed were from the devil's punishments. The magistrates questioned her for hours that first day. The crowd listened, rapt. TITUBA's testimony was everything they had hoped for and more. She described in vivid detail her encounters with the devil. "He came to her at night," she said, appearing first as a tall man with white hair, dressed in black clothes like a minister. He told her she must serve him or he would kill her. He showed her his book and demanded she sign it. When she refused, he hurt her, pinching her, threatening her with worse. Eventually, she said, she gave in. She signed the book, not with a pen but with blood from her finger. The devil pricked her finger and she made her mark. After that, he had power over her. He commanded her to hurt the children, and she had to obey. "How did you hurt them?" Hathorn asked. "He gave me things to use," TITUBA said. "Poppets, little dolls made of rags. He told me to stick pins in them, and when I did, the children would feel pain." "Where are these poppets now?" "I don't know. He took them away." "Who else have you seen with the devil?" "I saw Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne. They were at a meeting with the devil." "There were others too, a tall man with white hair and a woman with white hair. I don't know their names." This was crucial. TITUBA was describing not just individual witches, but a conspiracy, a coven of witches meeting together with the devil. This confirmed the magistrate's worst fears. It wasn't just a few isolated cases of witchcraft. It was an organized assault on the godly community. "Where did these meetings take place?" Hathorn asked. "At the minister's house," TITUBA said, and the crowd gasped. "They came at night, flying through the air. The devil brought them." "How did they fly?" "On sticks, like poles. They rode through the air." "Did you fly with them?" "Yes," TITUBA admitted. "The devil made me. We flew to Boston and back in one night." This detail, the flight to Boston, was particularly significant. It suggested the witchcraft conspiracy extended beyond Salem Village to the provincial capital. The threat was even larger than they had imagined. The examination continued into a second day, then a third. Each session drew larger crowds. People traveled from surrounding towns to hear TITUBA's testimony. She became the star witness, the one who could reveal the full extent of the conspiracy. And with each telling, her testimony expanded. She added more details, described more encounters, implicated more people without naming them directly. She spoke of a yellow bird that the devil gave her as a familiar spirit. It would suck blood from between her fingers. A black dog that appeared to her and demanded she serve the devil. A red cat and a black cat that were also familiar spirits. Midnight rides through the air to witch meetings. A white-haired woman and a tall man with white hair who were also witches, though she didn't know their names. The Devil's Book, which had 9 names in it, suggesting there were 9 witches in total, operating in the area. She wept frequently during her testimony, insisting she wanted to return to God, that she had been forced into the devil's service against her will. She begged forgiveness, said she would tell everything she knew if it would help catch the other witches. It was brilliant in its way. Every detail she provided was vivid enough to seem true, but vague enough to be unverifiable. She gave the magistrates exactly what they wanted. Not just a confession, but proof of a vast conspiracy. The hysteria that would consume Salem over the next months had its foundation in those 3 days of testimony. But there was something else in TITUBA's words. Something the magistrates didn't consciously register, but that the more astute listeners detected. She was describing real people. When she spoke of the tall man from Boston, certain families exchanged glances. When she mentioned the woman with white hair, whispers rippled through certain sections of the crowd. TITUBA was settling accounts. Consider what she was doing. She was an enslaved woman with no legal rights, no property, no power. She had been beaten, threatened, accused of a crime that carried the death penalty. She could have simply denied everything, like Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne. But she had seen what happened to them. Their denials were ignored, they were assumed guilty anyway, and they would likely be executed. So instead, TITUBA confessed. But she confessed strategically. She gave the magistrates a story that confirmed their beliefs about witchcraft, while also implicating people who had harmed her or whom she had reason to resent. The tall man from Boston in black clothes like a minister. That description could fit any number of merchants or officials who had visited Paris's household. The white-haired woman could be Sarah Osborne, yes, but also resembled other women in the village who had treated TITUBA poorly. She was painting her accusations in broad strokes that allowed others to fill in specific faces based on their own grievances. And it worked. Over the coming months, as more people were accused, many of them matched descriptions TITUBA had provided. She had given Salem a template for identifying witches, and the villagers used it enthusiastically. On the 3rd day of her examination, as her testimony wound down, Magistrate Hathorne made a crucial decision. TITUBA's confession was so valuable, so detailed, that she would not be tried immediately like the other 2 women. Instead, she would be held as a witness against other suspects. They needed her testimony to build cases against the real conspiracy she had revealed. TITUBA was led away to jail. She had saved her own life through her words, at least temporarily. Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne would eventually die. Sarah Osborne in prison of illness in May. Sarah Good hanged on Gallows Hill in July. But TITUBA would survive, because she had given Salem what it needed. Not just a witch, but a doorway into a hidden world of evil. The problem was that the doorway, once opened, couldn't be closed. March 1692 bled into April, and the accusations multiplied like a plague. The afflicted girls, emboldened by the magistrates' belief in their sufferings and empowered by the attention their afflictions brought them, began naming names. And the names they chose revealed the true nature of what was happening in Salem Village. On March 11th, Martha Corey was accused. This was shocking. Martha was a full church member, a woman known for her piety and sharp intelligence. She had made the mistake of expressing skepticism about the girls' afflictions, suggesting they might be faking. She had also questioned whether spectral evidence should be trusted. After all, if the devil could appear in someone's shape without their consent, how could you prove guilt? Her skepticism made her suspect. The logic was circular and inescapable. Only a witch would question the reality of witchcraft. Only someone in league with the devil would doubt the girls' testimonies. Martha's intelligence and independence, qualities that might have been admired in a man, made her dangerous as a woman. When Martha was brought in for examination on March 21st, the afflicted girls put on their most dramatic performance yet. They mimicked her every movement. When she shifted her weight, they shifted theirs. When she bit her lip, they cried out that they were being bitten. When she wrung her hands, they screamed that their hands were being wrung. It was a grotesque pantomime, and the magistrates took it as proof of her guilt. Clearly, she was controlling the girls through witchcraft, making them mirror her actions. Martha tried to defend herself with logic and reason. She pointed out the absurdity of the accusations, the lack of real evidence. But logic had no place in these proceedings. She was sent to jail to await trial. On March 23rd, Rebecca Nurse was accused. This was even more shocking than Martha Corey's arrest. Rebecca was 71 years old, a grandmother so devout that she was respected even by those who disagreed with her family on other matters. She was hard of hearing and physically frail. The idea that this elderly, pious woman was a witch seemed absurd, but Rebecca's family, the Nurses, were involved in a long-standing land dispute with the Putnam family. Years earlier, the Nurses had purchased land that the Putnams believed should have been theirs. The dispute had gone through the courts and been decided in the Nurses' favor, but the Putnams had never forgiven them. Now, with the witch hunt providing cover, old grievances could be settled. Ann Putnam Jr. was the primary accuser, claiming Rebecca's specter tormented her. Ann Putnam Sr., the girl's mother, also began having afflictions and accused Rebecca of murdering several of her infant children through witchcraft. This was a particularly cruel accusation. Ann Sr. had indeed lost multiple babies, a common tragedy in colonial times, but now she was attributing these natural deaths to supernatural malevolence. Rebecca's examination was heartbreaking. The old woman could barely hear the questions being asked. She stood confused and frightened while the girls writhed and screamed, accusing her of tormenting them. She protested her innocence in a weak voice. "I can say before my eternal Father I am innocent, and God will clear my innocency." But God did not clear her innocency, at least not in the eyes of the magistrates. She was sent to jail, and her arrest sent a clear message. No one was safe. If Rebecca Nurse could be accused, anyone could be. The pattern became clear. Anyone who questioned the proceedings, who expressed doubt about the girl's visions, became suspect themselves. Opposition was interpreted as evidence of guilt. The witch hunt had developed its own internal logic that made it self-perpetuating and impossible to stop. By the end of March, over a dozen people had been accused and arrested. By the end of April, the number had grown to over 30. The jails in Salem, Ipswich, and Boston were overflowing. Men and women from Salem Village and surrounding communities crowded into cells designed for far fewer prisoners. The conditions were horrific. Prisoners were kept in chains, not just handcuffs, but heavy iron shackles on their wrists and ankles, sometimes connected by chains to the walls. The weight of the chains caused injuries, cutting into flesh, making movement painful. The cells were dark, cold, and filthy. Prisoners received minimal food and had to pay for their own imprisonment. A fee was charged for each day in jail, for the chains, even for the arrest warrant. Those who couldn't pay suffered even worse conditions. Sarah Good gave birth to a baby in jail, manacled. The infant died within days. Sarah's 4-year-old daughter, Dorcas, was also arrested after the afflicted girls claimed the child's specter bit them. Little Dorcas was kept in chains so heavy she could barely move. She would survive the ordeal physically, but carry psychological scars for the rest of her life, never fully recovering from the trauma. The accusations followed patterns that revealed their true nature. People who were accused tended to be those involved in property disputes with accusers' families, those who had questioned the proceedings or expressed skepticism, those who were already marginalized, the poor, the elderly, the socially awkward, those whose families had opposed Reverend Parris or supported his enemies. Women who were too independent, too outspoken, too wealthy, or too poor. Anyone who had made enemies in the small, claustrophobic world of Salem Village. Behind the public spectacle, a more calculated campaign was unfolding. The Putnam family was at its center. Thomas Putnam was the most influential man in Salem Village, despite never holding high office. His family had been among the first settlers, and he owned significant landholdings, though not as much as he believed he deserved. His father's will had disappointed him, leaving substantial property to a stepmother Thomas despised. Several land disputes with neighbors had gone against him. He supported Reverend Parris fiercely, seeing in the minister an ally against the Salem town elite who looked down on village farmers. His wife, Ann Putnam Sr., who had suffered multiple miscarriages and infant deaths, 7 children lost before they reached adulthood. These tragedies had left her bitter and convinced that supernatural forces were working against her family. She began having afflictions in March, giving adult credibility to the children's testimonies. At 30 years old, she was the oldest of the afflicted, and her accusations carried particular weight. Their daughter, Ann Putnam Jr., was 12 years old and the most prolific of the afflicted girls. She would eventually accuse 62 people of witchcraft, more than any other accuser. Some historians would later note that nearly every person Ann accused had some connection to the Putnam family's grievances. People who had won land disputes against them. Families who supported rival factions in village politics. Those who had questioned Reverend Parris's right to certain property. But Ann Jr. was a child. Someone was guiding her accusations, providing names, describing old resentments in language a 12-year-old transformed into visions and spectral torments. That someone was her mother, Ann Putnam Sr., who would herself begin having afflictions in March. The Putnam women, mother and daughter, became the twin engines driving the witch hunt forward. The magistrates never questioned this pattern because it confirmed their worldview. Satan would naturally target a godly family like the Putnams. The fact that accusations lined up with temporal disputes was simply evidence that the devil worked through earthly grievances to divide communities. They investigated nothing, verified nothing. The spectral evidence, testimony that a witch's ghost or demon had appeared to cause harm, became sufficient for arrest and trial. In May, the crisis reached a new level. A new governor arrived in Massachusetts Bay Colony. Sir William Phips found his province in chaos, with jails full of accused witches and no legal framework for trying them. The previous governor had been recalled to England, leaving the colony in administrative limbo. Phips had been appointed to restore order, but he arrived to find a situation spiraling out of control. Phips quickly established a special court of Oyer and Terminer, a court with authority to hear and determine the witchcraft cases. The court's judges were drawn from the colony's elite. William Stoughton, the lieutenant governor, served as chief justice. The other judges included Samuel Sewell, John Richards, Nathaniel Saltonstall, Waite Winthrop, Bartholomew Gedney, John Hathorne, and Jonathan Corwin. These were powerful men, convinced of the witchcraft conspiracy's reality. Stoughton in particular was a hardliner, absolutely certain that Satan had established a kingdom in Massachusetts and that aggressive prosecution was necessary to destroy it. He would prove to be the driving force behind the executions to come. The court's first session was scheduled for early June. But before the trials could begin, the judges had to resolve a crucial legal question. What kind of evidence would be admissible? In English law, witchcraft was difficult to prove because it was an invisible crime. You couldn't see someone casting a spell or making a pact with the devil. You needed either a confession or testimony from witnesses who had seen suspicious activities. But the Salem cases relied primarily on spectral evidence, the testimony of afflicted persons that they had seen the accused person's specter tormenting them. The problem with spectral evidence was obvious. It was completely subjective and impossible to verify. If someone claimed to see your ghost attacking them, how could you prove they hadn't? You couldn't. The only defense was to deny it, but denial was taken as further evidence of guilt. It was a perfect trap. Some ministers and legal authorities expressed concerns about spectral evidence. Most notably, several Boston ministers wrote a letter urging caution, pointing out that the devil might appear in the shape of innocent people to deceive the afflicted. If that was possible, then spectral evidence alone couldn't prove guilt. But the judges, led by Stoughton, decided to allow spectral evidence. They reasoned that God wouldn't permit the devil to appear in the shape of innocent people. That would be too deceptive, too contrary to God's justice. Therefore, if someone's spectre was seen tormenting the afflicted, that person must have given the devil permission to use their shape, which meant they were guilty. This decision sealed the fate of everyone accused. With spectral evidence admissible, conviction was almost inevitable. The afflicted girl's visions, which couldn't be verified or challenged, became the primary evidence. And the girls, realizing the power they held, used it freely. The first trial was held on June 2, 1692. Bridget Bishop stood before the court of Oyer and Terminer, accused of witchcraft. Bridget was about 60 years old, a tavern keeper known for colorful dress and sharp tongue. She had been married 3 times, unusual for a woman of her era. She wore red bodices and other bright clothing that Puritans considered immodest. Her tavern was a place where people drank and played games like shovelboard, activities the more strict Puritans frowned upon. She had been accused of witchcraft once before, years earlier, though the charges had been dropped. Now she faced accusation again, and this time the court was determined to convict. The evidence against her included spectral evidence from the afflicted girls who claimed her spectre tormented them, testimony from neighbors who said she had appeared to them in spectral form years earlier, the discovery of poppets, rag dolls with pins stuck in them, supposedly found in the walls of her house during renovation, claims that she had a preternatural teat on her body where familiar spirits could suck. The poppets were particularly damaging. In the folklore of the time, witches supposedly made dolls representing their victims and stuck pins in them to cause pain. The fact that such dolls had allegedly been found in Bridget's house seemed like concrete evidence. Bridget denied everything. She insisted she was innocent, that she had never hurt anyone, that she knew nothing about witchcraft. But her denials were useless. The spectral evidence was overwhelming, and the judges were convinced of her guilt. The trial lasted only 1 day. The jury deliberated briefly and returned a verdict: guilty. Bridget Bishop was hanged on June 10, 1692, on a rocky outcrop that would become known as Gallows Hill. She was the first execution of the Salem witch trials, but she would not be the last. After Bridget's execution, there was a brief pause. One of the judges, Nathaniel Saltonstall, resigned from the court, reportedly disturbed by the proceedings and the reliance on spectral evidence. But he was quickly replaced, and the trials continued. The next session of the court was held in late June. 5 women were tried and convicted: Sarah Good, Rebecca Nurse, Susanna Martin, Elizabeth Howe, and Sarah Wilds. Rebecca Nurse's trial was particularly controversial. Despite the spectral evidence against her, many people testified to her good character. 39 members of the community signed a petition declaring their belief in her innocence. The jury initially returned a verdict of not guilty, but Chief Justice Stoughton was not satisfied. He sent the jury back to reconsider, pointing out testimony they had supposedly overlooked. Under pressure, the jury changed their verdict to guilty. Governor Phipps granted Rebecca a reprieve, but then rescinded it after the afflicted girls had renewed fits. Rebecca Nurse, 71 years old and pious to the end, was condemned to hang. Sarah Good went to her death cursing Reverend Nicholas Noyes, who urged her to confess. "You are a liar," she shouted at him. "I am no more a witch than you are a wizard, and if you take away my life, God will give you blood to drink." According to legend, Noyes died years later of a hemorrhage, choking on his own blood. The 5 women were hanged together on July 19, 1692. A crowd gathered to watch. The condemned were brought to Gallows Hill in a cart, their hands bound. They were allowed to pray and speak final words, though Sarah Good's curses were probably not what the authorities had hoped for. Then, one by one, they were hanged. Hanging in colonial times was not the quick death of a modern execution with a calculated drop to break the neck. The condemned were made to climb a ladder, a noose was placed around their neck, and then the ladder was removed. They died slowly of strangulation, their bodies jerking and convulsing as they suffocated. It could take several minutes. The crowd watched it all. After the bodies stopped moving, they were cut down and buried in shallow graves nearby. The families were not allowed to claim the bodies for proper burial. Witches didn't deserve Christian burial in consecrated ground, but Rebecca Nurse's family defied this order. Under cover of darkness, they retrieved her body and buried it secretly on their property. The exact location was kept secret for generations, marked only by a small stone to prevent authorities from disturbing the grave. August brought more trials and more executions. On August 19th, 5 more people were hanged. George Burroughs, John Proctor, John Willard, George Jacobs Sr., and Martha Carrier. George Burroughs was a former minister of Salem Village, a Harvard-educated man who had left the position years earlier after disputes with the congregation. He was accused of being the ringleader of the witches, the black man who presided over their meetings. The evidence against him was particularly flimsy. He was unusually strong for his size, supposedly lifting heavy barrels with ease, which was taken as evidence of supernatural strength. And he had been married multiple times, with some of his wives dying under circumstances that were now reinterpreted as suspicious. At the gallows, Burroughs recited the Lord's Prayer perfectly. This was significant because folklore held that witches couldn't recite the Lord's Prayer without making mistakes. His perfect recitation caused murmuring in the crowd. Perhaps he was innocent after all. But Cotton Mather, the influential Boston minister who had come to witness the execution, addressed the crowd from horseback. He assured them that the devil could appear as an angel of light, that Burroughs' ability to recite the prayer meant nothing. The execution proceeded. John Proctor had been a vocal opponent of the trials, calling the afflicted girls frauds and liars. He had written letters to Boston ministers begging them to intervene, to move the trials to Boston where cooler heads might prevail. His outspoken opposition made him a target. When he was accused, he knew it was retaliation for his criticism. His wife Elizabeth was also accused and convicted, but she was pregnant, and the execution of pregnant women was forbidden. She would survive in jail until after the trials ended. John Willard was a deputy constable who had been involved in arresting accused witches, but he became disturbed by what he was seeing. The flimsy evidence, the obvious innocence of many accused. He refused to make any more arrests. Shortly after, he himself was accused. The message was clear. You were either with the witch hunt or against it, and being against it made you suspect. George Jacobs Sr. was 80 years old, so frail he needed 2 canes to walk. His own granddaughter, Margaret Jacobs, testified against him, though she would later recant, saying she had been coerced and lied. But by then it was too late. Martha Carrier was called a rampant hag by Cotton Mather. She had a sharp tongue and didn't suffer fools. She had also been involved in a property dispute with the Putnam family. Her children were arrested and tortured until they testified against her. Faced with seeing their children in chains and threatened with worse, several accused witches' children gave false testimony against their own parents. September brought the final executions. On September 22nd, 8 more people were hanged. Mary Easty, Martha Corey, Ann Pudita, Samuel Wardwell, Mary Parker, Alice Parker, Wilmot Redd, and Margaret Scott. Mary Easty was Rebecca Nurse's sister. She had actually been released briefly after her initial arrest, but then the afflicted girls had renewed fits, and she was rearrested. She wrote a petition to the judges that stands as one of the most eloquent documents of the trials. I petition to your honors not for my own life, for I know I must die, and my appointed time is set, but that no more innocent blood may be shed. I would humbly beg of you that your honors would be pleased to examine these afflicted persons strictly and keep them apart some time, and likewise to try some of these confessing witches. I, being confident, there is several of them has belied themselves and others. She was asking the judges to do what they should have done from the beginning. Test the afflicted girls' testimonies, separate them to see if their stories remained consistent. Question the confessions that had been obtained through coercion and torture. But her petition was ignored. She was hanged with the others. Martha Corey, the church member who had questioned the proceedings, went to her death maintaining her innocence. Her husband, Giles Corey, had already died in a particularly horrific manner. Giles was 80 years old, a cantankerous farmer who had initially supported the trials, but then turned against them when his wife was accused. He himself was accused shortly after. But Giles refused to enter a plea. He wouldn't say guilty or not guilty. Under English law, a person who refused to plead couldn't be tried. This was a problem because if he wasn't tried, his property couldn't be confiscated. Giles was protecting his son's inheritance. The authorities had a solution: peine forte et dure, hard and forceful punishment. Giles was stripped and laid on the ground. A board was placed on his chest, and heavy stones were piled on top one by one. The weight was meant to force him to enter a plea, but Giles refused. For 2 days he lay under increasing weight, his ribs cracking, his breathing becoming more labored. Witnesses said that when the sheriff asked him to plead, Giles' only response was, "More weight." He died on September 19th, crushed to death, never having entered a plea. His property passed to his sons. It was a final act of defiance, and it came at a terrible cost. By the end of September, 19 people had been hanged, 1 had been pressed to death, and at least 5 more had died in prison. Dozens more awaited trial. The jails were overflowing. Families were destroyed. The community was traumatized, and through it all, TITUBA sat in her cell. The magistrates had lost interest in TITUBA as more exciting suspects emerged. They had her confession on record. They didn't need her testimony for subsequent trials. Her detailed confession had served its purpose. It had validated the existence of a witchcraft conspiracy and provided a framework for understanding the afflictions. But once that framework was established, TITUBA herself became irrelevant. Reverend Paris, who legally owned her, refused to pay her prison fees. In the bizarre accounting of the time, an accused person had to pay for their imprisonment, a fee for each day in jail, for the chains, for the food, such as it was, even for the arrest warrant. If found guilty and executed, their property was seized to pay these fees. But TITUBA had confessed, then provided information, putting her in a strange legal limbo. She was guilty but useful, enslaved but unpaid for. Paris's refusal to pay her fees was effectively abandoning her. He could have paid the fees and retrieved his property, but he chose not to. Perhaps he couldn't afford it. His salary was still in arrears, and he was struggling financially. Perhaps he was ashamed of her, embarrassed that his own enslaved woman had been the first to confess to witchcraft. Or perhaps he simply wanted to forget she existed, to erase this reminder of how the whole nightmare had started. In the dim jail cell, TITUBA had time to think. She shared space with other accused women, and she listened. She heard their stories, their protests of innocence, their confusion about who had accused them and why. A picture emerged in those whispered conversations, one that TITUBA had suspected but now confirmed. The accusations followed a pattern of property disputes, family rivalries, and petty grudges elevated to cosmic significance. Rebecca Nurse's family had been involved in land disputes with the Putnams. John Proctor had publicly called the afflicted girls frauds. Martha Corey had questioned the proceedings. George Burroughs had left Salem Village years earlier under contentious circumstances. On and on, each accusation could be traced to some mundane conflict, now recast as spiritual warfare. TITUBA understood because she had initiated this pattern. Her testimony had been strategic from the beginning. The tall man from Boston she described wore clothes similar to those worn by wealthy merchants who had, on occasion, visited Reverend Paris before he moved to Salem Village, men involved in business disputes with him. The white-haired woman resembled Sarah Osborne, yes, but also bore characteristics of other women who had treated TITUBA poorly. She had painted her accusations in broad strokes that allowed others to fill in specific faces based on their own grievances. She had weaponized the magistrate's fears and the community's paranoia, and it had worked beyond her darkest imaginings. But by autumn, the trials were beginning to collapse under their own weight. The problem was that the accusations kept expanding. Too many people had been accused, including increasingly prominent citizens. Wives of merchants were named. Ministers' relatives were accused. Even Governor Phipps's own wife, Lady Mary Phipps, was cried out upon by the afflicted girls. This was a turning point. When the accusations reached the very top of colonial society, the men in power suddenly became much more skeptical. The spectral evidence that had seemed so convincing when applied to marginal figures like Sarah Good or Rebecca Nurse appeared dangerously unreliable when it threatened the governor's wife. If anyone could be accused based solely on visions and dreams, then no one was safe. The very men who had promoted the trials began to fear for themselves and their families. There were other problems. Several of the confessed witches had recanted, saying they had lied under torture or coercion. Margaret Jacobs, who had testified against her grandfather, George Jacobs Sr., publicly recanted her testimony, admitting she had been forced to lie. She wrote, "They told me if I would not confess, I should be put down into the dungeon and would be hanged. But if I would confess, I should save my life." The confessions, which had been taken as proof of the conspiracy's reality, were revealed to be products of torture and fear. If the confessions were false, what did that say about the entire proceedings? In October, Reverend Increase Mather, one of the most influential ministers in the colony and father to Cotton Mather, published a treatise titled Cases of Conscience Concerning Evil Spirits. In it, he questioned the use of spectral evidence. His most famous line would be quoted for centuries: "It were better that 10 suspected witches should escape than that one innocent person should be condemned." This was a direct challenge to the trials. Increase Mather was not some marginal figure. He was president of Harvard, a man whose opinion carried enormous weight. His treatise was endorsed by 14 other prominent ministers. The message was clear. The trials had gone too far, and the methods being used were unreliable. Governor Phipps, seeing the political winds shift and worried about his wife's safety, dissolved the court of Oyer and Terminer on October 29, 1692. The trials were suspended. A new superior court was established with strict rules about evidence. Spectral testimony was no longer sufficient for conviction. Confessions obtained through coercion were inadmissible. Physical evidence was required. The new court convened in January 1693. Of 52 people tried under the new rules, only 3 were convicted, and Governor Phipps quickly pardoned them. By May 1693, all remaining accused persons had been released or pardoned. The witch hunt was over. The final toll was devastating. 19 people hanged. 1 person pressed to death. At least 5 deaths in prison. Over 200 people accused. Dozens of families destroyed. A community traumatized for generations, except for TITUBA. She remained in jail because Reverend Paris refused to pay her prison fees. In the strange economy of the time, she couldn't be released until someone paid for her imprisonment. Months passed. The other prisoners went home to try to rebuild shattered lives. Families sought restitution for loved ones executed or imprisoned. The community struggled to understand what had happened, how neighbors had turned on each other with such venom. TITUBA stayed in her cell through the winter of 1693 into spring, through summer. Paris made no move to retrieve her. He had left her to rot, either from poverty, spite, or shame. She was his property, but also his accusation. The first confession that had validated the entire nightmare. Perhaps he couldn't face her. Perhaps he simply wanted to forget she existed. The conditions of her continued imprisonment were harsh. By this point, she was alone. The other accused had been released or executed. She was kept in chains in a cold, dark cell. She received minimal food. No one visited her. She had been forgotten by everyone except the jailer who charged daily fees for her imprisonment. In April 1693, 13 months after her arrest, an unknown person paid TITUBA's prison fees. The amount was £7, a substantial sum, equivalent to several months' wages for a labourer. The jail records note only paid in full, with no name attached. TITUBA was released and immediately sold to a new owner to satisfy the debt. The transaction was recorded in a single line of a ledger. TITUBA, Indian woman, sold to name illegible for £7. Then TITUBA vanished from all historical documents. No record of her subsequent life exists. No death notice, no property transfer, no mention in anyone's diary or letter. The woman whose confession had ignited the most infamous witch hunt in American history disappeared as if she had never been. The official narrative of Salem took shape quickly after the trials ended. It was a mistake, the authorities claimed. A tragic delusion, perhaps caused by fraud or mass hysteria, exploited by scheming accusers. The judges issued formal apologies, though they were careful to say they had acted in good faith based on the evidence presented. Samuel Sewall, one of the judges, made a public confession of error in 1697, standing in church while his apology was read aloud. He was the only judge to do so. William Stoughton, the Chief Justice who had been the driving force behind the executions, never apologized and maintained until his death that the trials had been justified. The afflicted girls, as they grew older, largely remained silent. Most married and lived quiet lives, never publicly discussing their role in the trials. Ann Putnam, Jr. did eventually apologize publicly in 1706 when she joined the Salem Village Church. Her confession was carefully worded. "I desire to be humbled before God for that sad and humbling providence that befell my father's family in the year about 92. That I, then being in my childhood, should, by such a providence of God, be made an instrument for the accusing of several persons of a grievous crime, whereby their lives were taken away from them, whom now I have just grounds and good reason to believe they were innocent persons, and that it was a great delusion of Satan that deceived me in that sad time." She claimed she had been deluded by Satan, that she had never intended harm. She carefully avoided naming anyone who might have influenced her accusations. She took all the blame on herself, while simultaneously claiming she had been deceived. It was a masterful piece of rhetoric that accepted responsibility while denying agency. Ann Putnam, Jr. died young and unmarried in 1715, having spent much of her later life caring for younger siblings after her parents' deaths. Some historians have speculated that she was consumed by guilt, though there's no direct evidence of this. Others suggest she simply had a hard life in a community that never fully forgot her role in the trials. Reverend Samuel Parris was forced out of Salem Village in 1697 after years of contentious battles with his congregation. Many villagers blamed him for the trials, seeing his dark sermons and divisive leadership as having created the atmosphere that made the witch hunt possible. He left owing money and departed without paying TITUBA's replacement. His daughter Betty grew up and married, living a quiet life in Concord, with no apparent lasting effects from her afflictions. His niece Abigail Williams disappeared from records around 1697, with rumors she had died young, though no grave or death notice exists. The Putnam family maintained their influence in Salem Village for another generation, though their reputation was permanently tainted. Thomas Putnam died in 1699. His wife Anne Sr. died in 1699 as well. Their deaths came just 7 years after the trials, both dying relatively young. Some saw divine judgment in this, others noted that they had simply lived hard lives in a hard time. The executed were eventually exonerated, though it took decades. In 1702, the Massachusetts General Court declared the trials unlawful. In 1711, the colony began paying restitution to survivors and victims' families. The amounts were often insultingly small: £20 for a life taken, a few pounds for months of imprisonment. Some families received nothing because they couldn't prove their relative had been innocent or because bureaucratic obstacles prevented payment. In 1957, more than 250 years later, Massachusetts formally pardoned all who had been convicted. In 2001, the last 5 victims were officially exonerated by name. The process of acknowledging the injustice took over 3 centuries. But TITUBA was never exonerated because she had never been convicted. Her confession had saved her from trial, then condemned her to obscurity. The colonial authorities had no interest in drawing attention to the enslaved woman whose testimony had begun it all, whose strategic words had provided the foundation for 19 executions. Later, historians debated TITUBA's role endlessly. Some portrayed her as a victim, tortured into confession. Others suggested she genuinely believed in the magic she described, that she was practicing Caribbean folk traditions and had no idea they would be interpreted as devil worship. A few recognized what should have been obvious. TITUBA was brilliant, manipulative, and desperate, willing to say whatever necessary to survive, even if it meant condemning others. The truth was likely all of these and more. TITUBA had been stolen from her homeland, enslaved, dragged across the ocean to a frozen land where she was isolated and abused. When Reverend Paris beat her and demanded to know what she had done to his daughter, she had a choice. Maintain innocence and likely be executed as Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne would be, or confess and give the magistrates what they craved. She chose survival. And in crafting her confession, she was careful, so careful, to implicate people who had harmed her, even as she left details vague enough to be interpreted broadly. That tall man from Boston could have been any number of people. The white-haired woman might have been anyone the listeners wanted to see. TITUBA had opened a door and let Salem's own darkness pour through it. The resentments, the land disputes, the religious paranoia, the social hierarchies, all of it dressed up in tales of devil worship and spectral torment. But the document trail suggests something even more disturbing. In 1957, a historian researching the Salem trials at the Massachusetts Archives discovered a collection of documents that had been misfiled for over 2 centuries. Marion Starkey was working on her book, The Devil in Massachusetts, when she found them. A folder marked simply Salem Miscellaneous that contained original transcripts of TITUBA's examinations. These weren't the cleaned-up versions that had been published in the early 1700s. These were the actual notations made by the court recorder during her 3 days of testimony, complete with crossed-out sections, marginal notes, and annotations. What Starkey found was shocking. TITUBA's testimony had been substantially edited before being made public. The published versions removed dozens of specific details from her confession. References to particular merchants in Boston were struck out. Descriptions of certain prominent families' activities were deleted. Most tellingly, an entire section in which TITUBA described being approached by gentlemen in fine clothes from Salem town before the trials began was completely excised. In this deleted section, according to Starkey's notes, TITUBA described a man who came to the Paris household in late 1691, before the girl's afflictions began. He spoke with Reverend Paris privately, but TITUBA overheard parts of the conversation. The man was discussing the problem of the village and those who oppose godly order. He mentioned specific families by name, families that would later be targeted in the witch hunt. TITUBA's testimony suggested this man had essentially provided Paris with a list of enemies, people who were causing problems for certain interests in Salem town. When TITUBA was later forced to confess to witchcraft, she incorporated this man into her narrative as one of the witches she had seen. But the magistrates, recognizing who she was describing, had that section removed from the public record. Starkey wrote about these discrepancies in her book, but she framed them as evidence of TITUBA's coaching rather than what they actually suggested. TITUBA had known things, specific things about powerful people in colonial Massachusetts. Her testimony threatened to expose not just petty village disputes, but connections to the provincial elite. The documents disappeared shortly after Starkey's research. The archives claimed they had been returned to a private collection and were no longer available for study. No historian has been able to examine them since. Marion Starkey herself became notably silent on the subject in her later years, refusing to discuss the specific passages she had found. In interviews late in her life, she would change the subject when asked about the deleted sections of TITUBA's testimony. What was in those deleted sections? What did TITUBA actually know? Consider the timeline. TITUBA arrived in Salem Village with Reverend Parris in 1689. Parris had been a merchant in Barbados before becoming a minister, a failed merchant by most accounts who turned to the clergy when his business ventures collapsed. But Barbados in the 1680s was the center of the British Caribbean slave economy, where fortunes were made in sugar and human trafficking. The island was also a hub for smuggling, illegal trade, and the kind of murky financial dealings that built many of Boston's merchant fortunes. The connection between Barbados and Boston was strong. Many Boston merchants had interests in the Caribbean: plantations, trading partnerships, smuggling operations. They needed people in Barbados who could manage their interests, and they needed ministers in Massachusetts who could be relied upon to support the right political factions. What if TITUBA, as an enslaved woman in Parris's household in Barbados, had seen things, overheard conversations, learned names and connections? Enslaved people were invisible to their masters in the most dangerous way. The owners spoke freely in front of them, assuming they were too ignorant or too cowed to understand. But TITUBA was neither. When Parris brought her to Massachusetts, she would have carried that knowledge with her. She would have seen the same men who visited Parris in Barbados now visiting him in Salem Village. She would have heard the same names, the same business discussions. And when the witch trials began, when she was beaten and interrogated and threatened, she deployed it. The tall man from Boston wasn't a demon. He was a real person, someone connected to the Caribbean trade, someone whose involvement in the trials would have been devastating to reveal. The deleted passages that Marion Starkey found likely contained enough specific information to identify this person and his associates. That's why they were removed. That's why after the trials ended and apologies were issued and exonerations were granted, TITUBA was left to disappear. She knew too much. Her continued existence, her ability to speak, was a threat. The unknown person who paid her prison fees in April 1693 and then purchased her, that wasn't mercy. It was containment. Someone bought her silence along with her body, then made sure she could never tell her story again. Salem Village tried to forget. The meeting house where the examinations took place was eventually torn down. The homes of the executed were sold off. The accusers married and had children and told them nothing of what they had done. The village itself was renamed Danvers in 1752, perhaps hoping a new name would erase the old stain. But in the quiet hours, people remembered. They remembered the screaming girls and the crowded courtroom. They remembered neighbors led away in chains. They remembered the bodies hanging on Gallows Hill, and they remembered that it had all started with an enslaved woman's confession. Over the years, stories circulated. Travelers passing through claimed that on certain nights, you could still hear screaming from the old jail. Others said the site where Gallows Hill had been, its exact location now lost, deliberately obscured, was perpetually cold even in summer. These were the expected ghost stories, the kind that attach to any site of tragedy. But there were other stories, quieter ones, that never made it into the history books. Stories passed down through families who had been in Salem during the trials, whispered across generations. One such story concerned a woman matching TITUBA's description, who appeared in Portsmouth, New Hampshire in the late 1690s. She was enslaved to a merchant family there, and people noted she never spoke of her past. She worked in the household, tended the garden, knew herbs and their uses. She died in 1702 of smallpox, and was buried in an unmarked grave. The family that owned her paid for an unusually secure coffin, one with an iron lock, though she had died of disease and posed no risk to anyone. Why would they lock her coffin? What were they afraid she might do even in death? Another story placed TITUBA in Rhode Island, working for a Quaker family who treated their enslaved people with unusual kindness. This TITUBA supposedly told her story late in life to a young woman in the household who wrote it down but never shared it publicly. The manuscript, according to the story, was destroyed by the woman's family after her death because they feared it would stir up old troubles. What was in that manuscript? What version of events did TITUBA tell when she finally had a sympathetic listener? A third account came from a Boston merchant's diary entry from 1695, discovered in the 1920s and quickly returned to private hands. The merchant wrote about encountering a Caribbean woman at the docks who approached him and called him by a name he hadn't used since his time in Barbados. She smiled at him. He wrote and said, "The tall man from Boston remembers, I think." Then she disappeared into the crowd. The merchant never mentioned her again in his diary, but his entries from that point forward grew increasingly anxious, filled with references to old sins and divine judgment. He died in 1698, relatively young, of what was described as a wasting illness. Were any of these stories about the real TITUBA? There's no way to know. The historical record maintains its silence. But the stories themselves are telling. They suggest a woman who survived, who carried dangerous knowledge, who was both free and perpetually hunted. They suggest that powerful people continued to fear her long after the trials ended. There's another possibility, darker still. What if TITUBA never left Salem jail alive? What if the unknown person who paid her fees and purchased her did so not to employ her, but to silence her permanently? The transaction is recorded. £7 paid, TITUBA sold, but there's no record of where she went or who bought her. The name in the ledger is illegible, perhaps deliberately so. In colonial Massachusetts, the death of an enslaved person didn't require much documentation. They were property, not people. If TITUBA died shortly after her release, if her new owner disposed of her body in an unmarked grave or in the ocean, there would be no record. She would simply cease to exist in the documentary record, which is exactly what happened. This possibility is supported by the complete absence of any trace of her after April 1693. In a society that documented everything, births, deaths, property transfers, church memberships, legal disputes, TITUBA leaves no mark. For a woman who had been at the center of the most significant event in Salem's history, this absence is suspicious. It suggests not just obscurity but active erasure. The Salem witch trials are taught in American schools as a cautionary tale about mass hysteria and the dangers of false accusations. Students learn about spectral evidence and Puritan religious extremism. They might read Arthur Miller's The Crucible, which uses Salem as an allegory for McCarthyism. The message is always the same. This was a dark chapter, a mistake, something that could never happen now. But the part of the story that gets glossed over is the most important. Salem wasn't an accident. It was the weaponization of fear and accusation by people with power against those without it. It was the transformation of ordinary grievances into cosmic evil. It was what happens when testimony is valued over evidence, when confession is coerced, when the vulnerable are sacrificed to protect the comfortable. And at the heart of it was an enslaved woman who understood all of this, who saw the game being played and decided to play it herself. TITUBA's confession wasn't the hysterical raving of a tortured victim or the genuine belief of a folk practitioner. It was a calculated act of survival that turned the weapon of false accusation against those who had wielded it, if only for a moment. The fact that her testimony was edited, that documents were hidden, that she was made to disappear, all of this suggests that the authorities knew at some level what she had done. They knew she had been controlled and deployed. They knew the trials had been a corruption from the beginning, and they chose to bury that knowledge along with her. That's the story America never wanted told. Not the one about witches or ergot poisoning or mass delusion. The story about deliberate manipulation of law and fear by the powerful, enabled by a system that made certain people's voices count and others disappear. The story about how easy it is to turn neighbor against neighbor when the right mechanisms are in place. The story about who gets remembered and who gets erased. TITUBA's name appears in every account of Salem, but she herself remains invisible. The woman who sparked it all, whose words sent 19 people to their deaths, who outlived her accusers and judges and then vanished. We know almost nothing about her. Where she was born, how she learned what she knew, what she thought as she sat in that jail cell, listening to the screams of the dying, what became of her after someone bought her freedom and her silence. The archives stay closed. The documents remain missing. The descendants of Salem's prominent families maintain their respectability. And TITUBA stays buried in the blank spaces of history, a name without a face, a voice without an echo. But the fact that we don't know her story is itself part of the story. The erasure is the point. Some histories are too dangerous to tell, some truths too threatening to power to be allowed into the record. Salem couldn't afford to acknowledge that its witch hunt had been orchestrated, that testimony had been coached and edited, that an enslaved woman had been both victim and strategist. So they let her disappear, and in that disappearance, in that carefully maintained silence, lies the real horror of Salem. Not demons or witches or spectral torment, just people with power protecting themselves, and a woman who briefly threatened that power before being swallowed by the mechanism she had helped create. The question that haunts Salem isn't whether witches were real, it's what happened to TITUBA. Where did she go after April 1693? Did she live out her days in quiet servitude, carrying her secrets to an unmarked grave? Did she die shortly after her release, silenced permanently by those who feared what she knew? Or did she survive, moving from place to place, always looking over her shoulder, always aware that powerful people wanted her gone? We'll never know. The historical record is silent, and that silence is deafening. It tells us everything we need to know about who controls history, whose stories get told, and whose get buried. 300 years later, we're still telling stories about Salem. We've built museums and memorials. We've written books and plays and movies. We've analyzed the trials from every angle, psychological, sociological, legal, religious. But we still don't know what happened to the woman who started it all. Maybe that's intentional. Maybe some stories are meant to stay buried. Maybe the real lesson of Salem isn't about the dangers of superstition or the importance of due process. Maybe it's about power. Who has it, how they use it, and what they'll do to keep it. TITUBA understood power. She understood that in a world where she had none, the only weapon available was words. So she used them, carefully and strategically, to survive. And for a brief moment, she had more power than anyone in Salem. The power to name names, to shape the narrative, to determine who would be accused and who would be spared. But that power was temporary and dangerous. The moment she was no longer useful, she became a liability. And liabilities get eliminated. That's the story America never wanted told. Not because it's about witchcraft or Puritans or colonial Massachusetts, but because it's about now. About how power works, about who gets to speak and who gets silenced, about whose stories matter and whose disappear. TITUBA's story matters. Not because she was innocent. She wasn't by any reasonable measure. Her confession, however strategic, contributed to the deaths of innocent people. But her story matters because it reveals the machinery of oppression, the way systems of power use the vulnerable against each other, the way truth gets buried when it threatens the comfortable, and the fact that we still don't know what happened to her, that her fate remains a mystery after 3 centuries, tells us that the machinery is still running. The archives are still closed. The documents are still missing. The powerful are still protecting themselves. Some ghosts don't haunt houses, they haunt history. And TITUBA's ghost haunts every gap in the record, every missing document, every unanswered question about Salem. She's there in the silence, in the things we don't know and aren't allowed to know. Maybe that's the most terrifying thing about Salem. Not what happened, but what we're still not allowed to understand about what happened. Not the executions, but the erasure. Not the witch hunt, but the cover-up. And at the center of it all, invisible and inescapable, is a woman whose name we know but whose story we don't. A woman who spoke words that changed history, then disappeared into the silence that history creates for people like her. TITUBA, no family name, no place of origin, no grave, no ending. Just a name in the records, and a void where her life should be. That void is the story. That silence is the truth. And it's still speaking, if we're willing to listen. What do you think of this story? Could TITUBA have been silenced to protect powerful families, or was her disappearance just the tragic fate of countless enslaved people whose stories were never recorded? Leave your comment below, and if you want to discover more hidden stories from America's darkest chapters, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. History has a way of burying the truths that matter most, but we're here to dig them up.